There was a time, not that long ago really, when doctors looked at an open window the way you might look at a loaded gun. They saw sunshine pouring through glass and called it poison. They watched a breeze move curtains and diagnosed it as a killer. And they were not joking. They were not being careful or old-fashioned or overly cautious. They genuinely believed that fresh air could murder you in your sleep, that sunlight on your skin was an invitation to death, that the worst thing you could do for a sick person was let them breathe the air outside. Before we go any further, I want to know where you are right now. Are you in bed in California with the window cracked open? Sitting in a London flat with rain tapping glass? Lying in a hotel in Tokyo? Or on a couch in Sao Paulo? Or in a tent somewhere in Wisconsin? Wherever you are, type it in the comments. I like knowing where this voice is traveling tonight. And while you're down there, type in any topic you wanted to talk about next. Could be anything. The history of buttons. Why people used to think tomatoes were poisonous. How we invented the weekend. I will read them. I will pick one. And I will turn it into another long, slow walk through history that you can fall asleep to tomorrow night. Fair deal, right? Now, close your eyes for a second if you want. Feel the air around you. Notice the temperature. Notice if it is moving or still. Notice the light, if there is any, coming from a window or a lamp or a screen. You're doing something right now that would have horrified a respected physician in 1780. You are breathing air that came from outside. You probably think that is fine, normal even, healthy obviously. But for a very long time, some of the smartest, most educated, most respected medical minds in Europe and America would have called you reckless. They would have covered your windows with thick curtains, sealed your doors with cloth, kept you in a dark, stuffy room, and told you it was for your own good. And they would have written papers about it, published books, taught students, built entire systems of treatment around the idea that the outside world was dangerous and the inside world was safe. So what happened? How did we go from open the window and you will die to open the window and you will heal? How did sunshine turn from villain to cure? And why, if this belief was so widespread and so wrong, did it take so long to figure out the truth? That is what we are here for tonight. This is not a story about stupid people. It is a story about people who were trying to make sense of a world that kept killing them in ways they could not see. They did not have microscopes that could show them bacteria. They did not have germ theory. They did not have controlled experiments or peer review or blood tests or x-rays. They had patterns. They had guesses. They had ideas passed down from ancient Greece and Rome. And they tried their best to keep people alive. And sometimes their best ideas were exactly backwards. You have probably heard the phrase bad air. Maybe you have heard the word miasma. It sounds fancy, old, like something out of a Gothic novel. But for centuries, miasma was not a metaphor. It was considered a medical fact, a scientific reality. Miasma was the name given to the invisible poison that doctors believed floated through the air and caused disease. They thought it came from rotting things, from swamps, from garbage piles, from corpses, from sewage, from anywhere that smelled bad, basically. And the idea was simple. If it smells wrong, it can kill you. Now, that is not completely insane, is it? Bad smells often do come from dangerous places. A pile of rotting meat is not good for you. A stagnant swamp filled with dead plants can make you sick. So the observation was not totally off, but the explanation was backwards. They thought the smell itself was the danger. So they tried to fight it with other smells. They burned herbs. They carried flowers. They walked around with little pouches of perfume pressed to their noses. They thought that good smells could fight bad smells. And if you could cover up the stink, you could survive the plague. Spoiler, that did not work. But here's the thing. Miasma theory was not just some folk belief your grandmother's grandmother whispered about while baking bread. It was official. It was institutional. It was taught in medical schools in Paris and London and Vienna. It shaped public health policy. It determined how cities were built, how hospitals were designed, how wars were fought. And part of miasma theory said this: the air outside, especially at night, especially near water, especially in summer, was loaded with poison. So if you were sick, the worst thing you could do was open a window. Let that sit for a second. If you had a fever in 1820 and you called a doctor, one of the first things he might do is make sure your windows were shut tight. He might tell your family to keep the room warm, to keep the curtains drawn, to keep you still and closed off from the world, because the world was dangerous and the room was safe. And if you got worse, he would assume it was because the miasma had already gotten in, not because you were suffocating in a hot, dark box with no airflow. Now, sunshine. Let's talk about sunshine. You probably grew up being told to go outside and get some fresh air, to play in the sun, to soak up vitamin D, to let the light touch your skin because it is good for you. And that idea feels obvious now, does not it? Sunshine equals health. Everyone knows that. But for a long time, that was controversial. In fact, it was worse than controversial. It was considered dangerous. Pale skin was prized, not just because of beauty standards, though that was part of it, but because pale skin meant you stayed inside. And staying inside meant you were safe from the air, safe from the sun, safe from the invisible killers floating around in the breeze. Tan skin meant you worked outside. It meant you were exposed. It meant you were poor, probably laboring in fields and therefore at risk. So doctors told people to stay out of the sun. They especially told this to sick people, and to children, and to pregnant women, and to anyone who was pale and delicate and worth protecting. And that advice killed people. Not directly, not immediately, but over time, it kept them from the very thing their bodies needed. Sunlight helps your body make vitamin D. Vitamin D helps your bones grow strong. It helps your immune system fight infections. It helps your mood stay stable. Without it, children developed rickets. Adults developed bone diseases. Everyone got sicker, slower, weaker. But the doctors did not connect those dots. They could not. They did not know about vitamins yet. That science did not exist. So they kept the curtains closed. They kept the patients inside. They kept them safe from the sun. And people died in dark rooms, surrounded by care. Now, you might be wondering, did no one notice? Did no one say, hey, maybe the people who go outside seem healthier? Did no one question this? Some did, but they were ignored, or mocked, or written off as radicals. Because here's the trick: when everyone believes the same thing, it stops sounding like a belief. It starts sounding like reality. And when reality is built on a mistake, fixing it does not just take evidence. It takes a whole new way of seeing the world. That is what this story is about. It is about how we were wrong, how we stayed wrong, how we defended being wrong with diagrams and books and universities and legal systems, and how, eventually, slowly, painfully, we turned the whole thing around. But it took centuries. It took wars. It took plagues. It took shipwrecks and prisons and experiments done by accident. It took people dying in patterns that finally made someone say, wait, what if we have this backwards? And then it took even longer to convince everyone else. So tonight, we're going to walk through that slowness. We're going to sit with the confusion. We're going to meet the doctors who meant well and did harm, the patients who trusted and suffered, the rebels who were right too early, and the moments where everything flipped. Not because this is a story about medicine, really, but because it is a story about belief, about how we build whole worlds on ideas we inherit, about how hard it is to see clearly when everyone around you sees the same fog, and about how the simplest things, air and light, can be feared or loved depending on what story we tell ourselves about them. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop. This is going to be a long walk, a slow one, the kind where you might drift off halfway through and pick it up again tomorrow night. And that is fine. And by the end, you're going to understand not just what doctors believe, but why they believed it. Not just when it changed, but how. Not just the science, but the humans. The fear, the hope, the mistakes that looked like wisdom until someone opened a window and let the light in. Let's begin. You probably learned in school that medicine used to be primitive and then it got better. That once upon a time people did not know about germs, and then someone invented the microscope, and then we figured it out, and now we wash our hands and take antibiotics and everything is fine. That is the clean version. The version that fits neatly into a timeline on a classroom wall. But the truth is messier than that. Because the people who believed fresh air was deadly were not living in the Dark Ages. They were not superstitious peasants muttering prayers over chicken bones. They were educated. They were wealthy. They ran hospitals. They published research. They taught at the best universities in the world. And they were convinced, absolutely convinced, that letting night air into a sick room was basically the same as inviting death inside. The story you probably know goes like this. Old-timey doctors were silly and wrong, and then modern doctors came along and fixed everything. But here's what actually happened. For most of human history, doctors inherited their knowledge. They did not test it. They did not question it. They read old books written by men who had been dead for 1,000 years, and they treated those books like Bibles. The most important of those men was a Greek physician named Galen. He lived in the 2nd century in Rome, and he was brilliant. He dissected animals. He observed wounds. He wrote hundreds of texts on anatomy, disease, diet, and treatment. And for the next 1,400 years, his words were law. Galen believed that the body was controlled by 4 fluids, which he called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And health, he said, was all about balance. Too much of one humor, and you got sick. The doctor's job was to restore the balance. So if you had a fever, you had too much blood. Solution? Bleed you. Cut open a vein and let some out. If you had a cough, you had too much phlegm. Solution? Make you vomit or sweat or spit until it came out. And if you lived in a place where the air smelled bad, well, that air was full of corrupt vapors that would unbalance your humors from the inside. Solution? Stay away from it. Seal yourself off. Protect yourself from the outside. This was not fringe medicine. This was the medicine. In Paris, in London, in Vienna, in Edinburgh, the best minds in Europe spent centuries refining Galen's ideas, not replacing them. And woven into all of it was this notion that the environment could poison you, that certain kinds of air were dangerous, that swamps, rivers, and coastal winds carried invisible sickness. Now, to be fair, they were observing something real. People who live near swamps did get sick more often. People in crowded, dirty cities did die of fevers. Soldiers camped near rivers did collapse with mysterious illnesses. But the why was wrong. They thought it was the air itself, the smell, the vapor, the night mist rolling in from the marsh. They did not know about mosquitoes. They did not know that still water breeds insects that carry malaria. They did not know that overcrowded cities with no sewage systems create conditions for cholera and typhus to spread through contaminated water, not bad smells. They saw the pattern, but they guessed the wrong cause. And once that guess became official knowledge, it became very, very hard to unlearn. By the 18th century, this idea had a name: miasma. It came from the Greek word for pollution. And miasma theory said that diseases were caused by foul air rising from decaying organic matter. If you could smell rot, you were in danger. If the air felt damp and heavy, it could kill you. If the wind blew in from the wrong direction, you could catch a fever just by breathing. And the corollary to that belief was this: fresh air from outside, especially at night, was not refreshing. It was risky, because night air was considered especially dangerous. It was cool. It was damp. It came creeping in through cracks and keyholes, and doctors genuinely believed it could strike you down while you slept. There are medical journals from the 1700s and early 1800s that warn against sleeping with windows open, that describe cases where a patient was doing fine until someone opened a window, and then the patient died, and the doctor wrote it up as proof that night air was lethal. No one checked for other causes. No one thought maybe the person was already dying. No one considered that a stuffy, overheated room with no ventilation might be worse than a cool breeze. They just wrote it down, published it, taught it to the next generation of doctors. And those doctors went out into the world and closed more windows. Now, let us talk about sunshine. You might think sunlight has always been understood as good for you. After all, plants need it. Animals seek it. Humans feel better in it. But for a long time, medical authorities were suspicious of it. Not because they thought the sun itself was evil, but because they thought too much exposure to heat and light could unbalance the humors, especially for people who were already sick. If you had a fever, you were already too hot. So why would you add more heat? That was the logic. If you had inflammation, you were already red and swollen. So why would you expose yourself to something that makes skin red and swollen? It made sense in a backwards kind of way. And beyond that, there was a social reason to avoid the sun. Pale skin was a status symbol. It meant you did not have to work outside. It meant you were refined, delicate, protected. Tan skin meant labor. It meant fields and docks and roads. It meant poverty. And doctors, who mostly served the wealthy, reinforced this. They told their patients to stay indoors, to keep their skin covered, to avoid the sun, especially during the hottest parts of the day. They prescribed rest in dark rooms. They recommended heavy curtains. They even designed special sick rooms in hospitals with minimal windows because they believed that controlling the environment meant controlling the disease. And here is the tragedy. They were trying to help. They were not cruel. They were not lazy. They were working with the best information they had. But the best information they had was wrong. And because it came from ancient authorities, because it was written in Latin and taught in universities and practiced in hospitals, it carried weight. It was not just belief. It was institutional truth. And institutional truth does not change quickly. Even when people start to notice problems. Even when some patients got better after breaking the rules. Even when a few doctors began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, fresh air was not the enemy. Because here's the thing about paradigm shifts. They do not happen all at once. They happen in pieces, in arguments, in quiet rebellions, in moments where someone breaks the rule and gets lucky, and then someone else notices, and then someone else tries it, and then, decades later, it becomes normal. But before it becomes normal, it has to survive being called dangerous. And for a very long time, the idea that fresh air and sunshine could heal you was considered exactly that. Dangerous. So where did this fear come from? If you go back far enough, before Galen, before the Greeks, before anyone wrote anything down, humans lived outside. They slept under stars. They woke with the sun. They breathed whatever air was around them because they had no choice. And they survived. Not easily. Not safely, but they survived. So the fear of fresh air is not ancient. It is not primal. It is not something humans always believed. It is something we learned, and we learned it from cities. Because once people started living close together, in walls, in houses, in towns, things started to smell. Garbage piled up. Animals lived in streets. Human waste went into ditches or rivers, or just sat there, rotting in the heat. And people got sick. They got sick in waves, in patterns. Whole neighborhoods would collapse with fever. Whole families would die within days of each other. And no one knew why. So they looked for explanations. They noticed that sickness seemed to come from certain places. The poor quarters, the docks, the areas near the river, the alleys where the sun never reached and the air never moved. They noticed that sickness seemed to come with certain smells. Rot, decay, sewage, death. And they made a connection. Smell equals sickness. Bad air equals disease. It was a reasonable guess. And once that guess was written down by someone important, it became knowledge. Hippocrates, the Greek physician from the 5th century BC, wrote about it. He said that epidemics were caused by changes in the air and water, that certain winds brought disease, that living near marshes was dangerous. He was not wrong that marshes were dangerous, but he was wrong about why. Still, his writings survived. They were copied. They were studied. They were translated into Latin and Arabic and Hebrew. They were taught to students in Baghdad and Cordoba and Paris. And his ideas became the foundation of Western medicine. Then came Galen, a few centuries later. Galen expanded on Hippocrates. He wrote more. He was more detailed. He dissected animals and made guesses about human anatomy. He described how the body worked, how disease spread, how to treat imbalances. And embedded in all of that was this concept. The environment affects your internal state. If the air around you is corrupt, it corrupts you. Now, again, there's truth in that. Environment does matter. But Galen did not know about bacteria. He did not know about viruses. He did not know about contagion in the way we understand it now. He thought disease was a kind of atmospheric pollution that you absorbed. And that idea stuck. It stuck through the fall of Rome. It stuck through the Middle Ages. It stuck through the Renaissance. It stuck through the Enlightenment. Even as other ideas changed, even as astronomy and physics and chemistry advanced, medicine stayed locked in this ancient framework. Because here is the thing. Medicine is hard to test. You cannot run clean experiments on human bodies the way you can on metals or plants or stars. People die for all kinds of reasons. They recover for all kinds of reasons. And when your theory says that disease is caused by invisible air, it is very hard to prove that theory wrong. You can always say, well, the miasma must have been stronger than we thought. Or the patient must have been exposed before we treated them. Or the treatment would have worked if we had started sooner. There's always an explanation that keeps the theory alive. And so miasma theory survived. Not because it was correct, but because it was flexible enough to absorb failure. By the time we get to the 1700s, cities in Europe are bigger than ever. London, Paris, Amsterdam, Vienna. Hundreds of thousands of people packed into spaces that were never designed for that many bodies. And disease is everywhere. Smallpox, typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, dysentery. People are dying in hospitals, dying in prisons, dying in workhouses, dying at home. And the doctors, the good ones, the ones who care, are trying to figure out why. They walk through the wards and they smell death. They smell sweat and blood and infected wounds and unwashed bodies and chamber pots that have not been emptied. And they think, this is it. This is the problem. The air in here is poison. So they try to fix it. They burn herbs. They sprinkle vinegar. They carry pomanders, little balls of perfume, to protect themselves. They design hospitals with high ceilings to let the bad air rise. They build windows, but they keep them closed because they believe that outside air, especially night air, is even worse. They're trying. They are thinking. They are applying logic. But the logic is backwards. And because the logic is backwards, the solutions make things worse. A closed room with no airflow is a perfect place for tuberculosis to spread, for infections to fester, for fevers to kill. But they do not see that. They see a room protected from the outside, a controlled environment, a place where, in theory, healing can happen. And when patients die anyway, they do not blame the sealed windows. They blame the miasma that must have already gotten in. It is a closed loop, a system that reinforces itself. And it will take something dramatic to break it. Not just one discovery, not just one doctor, but a series of accidents, observations, conflicts, and rebellions that slowly, over decades, crack the foundation of this ancient belief. But we are not there yet. Right now, we are still in the fear. still in the darkness, still in the sealed rooms where patients lie sweating, wondering why the windows are closed, why the curtains are drawn, why no one will let the light in. Let us talk about power for a moment, because this is not just a story about wrong ideas. It is a story about who gets to decide what is true. And for most of history, that power belonged to a very small group of people. The church, the universities, the royal courts, the guilds. If you were a doctor in 1750, you did not just wake up one day and start treating patients. You had to be trained. You had to study under someone who had been trained. You had to read the approved texts. You had to pass exams. You had to join a guild or a college of physicians. And all of those institutions were built on the same foundation, ancient knowledge. Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, the old masters. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you quoted them. If you wanted to publish, you referenced them. If you wanted to teach, you defended them. And if you disagreed with them, you were not just wrong. You were dangerous, because challenging medical orthodoxy meant challenging the people who control medicine. And those people had power, social power, legal power, economic power. In England, the Royal College of Physicians could decide who was allowed to practice medicine in London. If you were not a member, you could be fined. You could be imprisoned. In France, the medical faculty at the University of Paris controlled what could be taught, what could be published, what treatments were legal. These were not just academic institutions. They were gatekeepers, and they had every reason to protect the system they were built on. Because if Galen was wrong, then what did that say about the last 1,000 years of medicine? What did that say about all the treatments, all the books, all the careers built on his ideas? It is hard to admit you have been wrong. It is even harder to admit that everyone you respected, everyone you learned from, everyone who came before you was also wrong. So instead, you defend it. You refine it. You explain away the failures. And that is exactly what happened. When miasma theory started to show cracks, the response was not to abandon it. The response was to make it more complicated. Doctors started categorizing different kinds of bad air: marsh miasma, urban miasma, epidemic miasma, contagious miasma. They built elaborate maps showing where the dangerous air was most concentrated. They published reports on wind patterns and temperature and humidity and how all of those factors influence the spread of disease. They were trying to save the theory, to make it work, to patch the holes. And in doing so, they made it unfalsifiable. Because now if someone said, "I opened a window and the patient got better," the response could be, "Well, yes, but that was a different kind of air. That was mountain air, or sea air, or country air. We're talking about urban air, night air, swamp air." The theory could bend to fit any outcome, and that made it nearly impossible to kill. Now, the church played a role in this too, though not always in the way you might think. Medieval and early modern Christianity did not exactly forbid fresh air, but it did emphasize suffering, humility, and distrust of the body. The body was fallen. The body was sinful. The body was a prison for the soul. And comfort, pleasure, ease, those were suspicious. Those could lead you astray. So the idea of lying in the sun, of enjoying a breeze, of feeling physically good, that carried a little bit of moral danger. Not enough to ban it outright, but enough to make it seem less virtuous than staying inside, praying, reading, suffering quietly in a dark room. Monasteries and convents were often built with small windows, thick walls, dim light, partly for practical reasons, yes, but partly because that environment was seen as spiritually appropriate. Suffering brought you closer to God. Comfort did not. And since many hospitals in Europe were originally run by religious orders, that attitude seeped into medical care. Patients were not supposed to be comfortable. They were supposed to be penitent. And fresh air, sunlight, those felt too much like pleasure. So the windows stayed small. The rooms stayed dark. And no one questioned it, because it fit the worldview. Then there is the military. Armies have always been laboratories for disease. You take thousands of men, cram them into camps, march them through swamps, feed them poorly, and wait. Disease kills more soldiers than battle ever did. And officers notice patterns. Camps near rivers had higher death rates. Camps in low valleys had more fevers. Camps that stayed in one place too long started to stink, and then men started to die. So military doctors wrote reports. They advised generals to move camps often, to avoid marshes, to burn waste, to keep things clean, and they attributed all of it to miasma. They thought the smell was the danger. So they tried to fight it with smoke, with lime, with vinegar. They built latrines far from camp. They dug drainage ditches. They issued orders about where soldiers could and could not sleep. And some of those measures actually helped, not because they fought miasma, but because they reduced exposure to mosquitoes and contaminated water. But since the theory was wrong, the lessons learned were inconsistent. Sometimes fresh air helped. Sometimes it did not seem to. Sometimes moving camp worked. Sometimes it did not. And without a correct understanding of what was actually happening, those patterns just looked like chaos. So the old beliefs held, because the old beliefs at least gave you something to do. They gave you a framework, a system, a sense of control in a world that felt wildly, violently out of control. And that is what power does. It does not just enforce ideas. It makes those ideas feel necessary. It makes questioning them feel dangerous. And it makes the people who benefit from those ideas invisible. Because the doctors who kept windows closed were not villains. But they were also not neutral. They had status. They had income. They had authority. And all of that depended on people believing they knew what they were doing. If fresh air turned out to be the cure, what did that say about all the patients who had died in sealed rooms? What did that say about the expensive treatments, the bleedings, the purges, the drugs that did nothing? It is easier to defend a mistake than to face what that mistake cost. And so the institutions, the guilds, the universities, the hospitals, they dug in. They published more papers. They trained more students. They built more rules. And the windows stayed closed. Let's step inside one of these rooms for a moment. Not as a doctor, not as a theorist, not as someone reading about this in a book 100 years later, but as a person, a sick person, lying in a bed in London in 1790. You have a fever. You have been sweating for 3 days. Your head aches. Your throat is raw. You are thirsty all the time, but drinking makes you feel worse. Someone called for a doctor. Your family paid for it, which means they care, which means they have a little bit of money, which means you're not in the worst situation possible. The doctor arrives. He is older. He wears a dark coat. He smells like tobacco and something else, something medicinal you cannot quite place. He does not touch you much. He looks at your tongue. He feels your pulse. He asks questions about your bowel movements, your sleep, your appetite, and then he looks around the room. He notices that the window is open a crack. Just a crack. Just enough to let in a little bit of air because the room smells like sweat and sickness, and you have been lying here for days. He frowns. He walks over to the window and closes it. Firmly. He latches it. He tells your mother, or your wife, or whoever is taking care of you, that the night air is dangerous, that it will make the fever worse, that you must be kept warm and still and sealed off from the outside. He might prescribe a tonic. He might recommend bleeding. He might say to cover you with extra blankets to make you sweat the fever out. And then he leaves, and you are lying there in a room that is now even hotter, even stuffier, even harder to breathe in. You want to ask someone to open the window, but you have been told it is dangerous. You have been told that the doctor knows best. So you stay quiet. You lie there, trying to breathe through the thickness of the air. You feel your own heat radiating back at you from the blankets. You smell yourself and the sheets and the chamber pot in the corner that has not been emptied yet, because the person taking care of you is exhausted and there's only so much they can do. You close your eyes. You try to sleep. You drift in and out. And maybe you get better. Maybe your body fights off whatever infection this is. Maybe in a week you're sitting up, eating a little soup, feeling weak but alive. And when that happens, everyone says the doctor was right. The treatment worked. Keeping the room sealed kept you safe. Or maybe you do not get better. Maybe the fever gets worse. Maybe your breathing gets shallow. Maybe you stop making sense when you talk. And then, quietly, you die. And when that happens, everyone says the miasma must have gotten in before the doctor arrived. That it was already too late. That there was nothing anyone could do. Either way, the belief holds. Because the belief is not based on testing. It is based on authority. And authority does not need to be right. It just needs to be respected. Now, imagine you're not wealthy. Imagine you are poor. You do not get a doctor. You cannot afford one. You live in a tenement. A building with dozens of other families crammed into rooms that were meant for one. The walls are thin. The ceiling leaks. There is one window, and it is not closed properly, so the cold gets in during winter and the heat gets in during summer. You work outside. Maybe you haul goods at the docks. Maybe you sell things in a market. Maybe you wash clothes in the river. You're outside all the time, breathing the air, feeling the wind, standing in the rain. And you get sick too. Everyone gets sick. But you do not have the option of staying in a sealed room. You do not have heavy curtains or a fireplace or someone bring you meals. You just keep going until you cannot. And when you die, no one writes it down as a medical case. No one studies it. No one wonders if maybe the air was not the problem. You are just another body, another number, another poor person who did not survive the winter. And here is the strange irony. You probably lasted longer than the rich person in the sealed room. Because you were outside. You were moving. You were breathing fresh air, even if you did not know that was helping you. But no doctor noticed that pattern. Because no doctor was paying attention to you. The medical journals were full of cases from private practices, from hospitals that served the middle class and the wealthy, from people who could afford to follow the rules. And those people were being treated according to the theory, which meant they were being kept inside, kept still, kept in conditions that made it harder for their bodies to fight infection. But the poor, the ones who had no choice but to live and work outside, they were accidentally doing the thing that helped. And no one connected the dots. Now, let us talk about children. If you were a child in the 18th century, your life was fragile. You could die from smallpox, from measles, from scarlet fever, from a bad cough that turned into pneumonia, from diarrhea that would not stop, from a cut that got infected. You could die from being too cold or too hot, from not eating enough or eating something spoiled, from falling into a river or being kicked by a horse, or just being in the wrong place when disease swept through your town. And if you were wealthy, your parents tried to protect you by keeping you inside. They dressed you in layers. They kept you out of the sun. They did not let you run around too much because exertion was thought to unbalance the humors. They kept your skin pale. They kept your room dim. They fed you bland, soft foods because anything too rich or spicy might inflame your system. And many of those children grew up weak, thin, prone to sickness. Their bones did not develop properly. They had rickets, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin D, which comes from sunlight. Their legs bowed. Their ribs protruded. They tired easily. And their parents, who loved them, who were trying so hard to keep them safe, had no idea they were part of the problem. Meanwhile, poor children, the ones who played in the streets, who worked in the fields, who spent their days outside in the sun and the wind, they had stronger bones. Not always. Not guaranteed. Poverty came with its own disasters. But the ones who survived were often healthier in some ways than their wealthier counterparts. And again, no one noticed the pattern. Because the theory said sunshine was risky. The theory said outside air was dangerous. So the evidence that contradicted the theory was ignored. Let's talk about smell for a moment, because smell was everywhere in this world. You have probably never experienced the level of smell that was normal in a city in 1800. Garbage was not collected. It was thrown into the street or into a ditch or into the river. Human waste was dumped into pits or alleys. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows. Animals lived in the streets. Horses, pigs, chickens, dogs. And they left their waste everywhere. Butchers worked in open stalls. Blood ran into gutters. Entrails were piled up and left to rot. Tanneries soaked hides in urine and lime. Dye works dumped chemicals into rivers. Factories belched smoke that mixed with fog and created a thick, yellow haze that people called pea soup. And in the summer, when it was hot, everything smelled worse. The heat made the rot more intense. It made the air feel heavy. It made your clothes stick to your skin and your throat feel coated. And people truly believed, that the smell itself could kill them. So they tried to cover it up. They carried flowers. They held handkerchiefs soaked in lavender or rose water to their faces. They burned incense in their homes. They thought that if they could not smell the rot, they were safe. But of course they were not, because the smell was not the problem. The problem was the waste itself, the contaminated water, the flies, the rats, the lack of sanitation. But without germ theory, without an understanding of bacteria, they had no way of knowing that. So they kept focusing on the smell, and they kept closing the windows. Because if the air outside smelled bad, then the air outside was dangerous. And the air inside, even if it was stale and hot and barely breathable, at least it was controlled. At least it was theirs. Now, think about what it felt like to be a person living in this world. You wake up before dawn because there is work to do. If you are poor, you are already tired. You did not sleep well. Your bed is a straw mattress that is lumpy and full of bugs. You share it with 2 or 3 other people. You get dressed in clothes that you have worn for days, maybe weeks. You do not have many options. Washing clothes is hard. It takes time and water and effort. You eat something small. Bread, maybe. Some cheese if you are lucky. You drink weak beer because the water is not safe. You go outside. The streets are narrow and dark. The buildings lean and close. The sky is a strip of gray above you. You walk to work. You pass people who are coughing, people who look sick, people who are begging, people who are dead, sometimes just lying there until someone moves them. You work all day, hard physical labor. Your back hurts. Your hands are raw. You come home. You eat again. Something simple. Soup, porridge, bread. You sit by a fire if you can afford one. You talk a little. You are too tired to talk much. You go to bed, and you do it again the next day, and the next, and the next, until you get sick, and then everything stops, and you lie in a room, hot and still and sealed, and you hope that you survive. Because if you do not, no one will remember you. No one will write about you. You will just be gone, and the world will keep moving. Let us talk about the window, not as an architectural feature, not as a piece of construction, but as a symbol, as an idea, as a boundary between 2 worlds. The window is where this whole story lives, because the window is the thing that separates inside from outside, safety from danger, control from chaos. And for a very long time, the window was the front line in the battle against miasma. Now, windows have been around for thousands of years. The Romans had glass windows, though they were rare and expensive. Most people used shutters or oiled cloth, or just left the opening empty and covered it when the weather was bad. But by the 1600s and 1700s, glass windows were becoming more common, at least in Europe. They were still a luxury for many. But in cities, in the homes of merchants and doctors and clergymen, windows with glass panes were normal. And those windows were designed to open and close, which meant you had a choice. You could let the outside in, or you could keep it out. And that choice became a medical decision. Doctors wrote entire treatises about windows, about when to open them, about when to close them. about what kinds of air were safe and what kind were deadly. Some said windows should never be opened at night. That night air carried a special kind of danger, a dampness, a chill, a miasmic quality that daylight burned away. Others said windows should be opened only in certain seasons. That summer air was safer than winter air, or the reverse, or that it depended on which direction the wind was blowing. There were debates about whether a window facing east was safer than one facing west, about whether upper floors were safer than lower floors, about whether coastal air was better or worse than inland air. All of this was taken seriously. It was published. It was taught. It influenced how buildings were designed. Hospitals started to include architectural features specifically meant to control air. High ceilings to let bad air rise. Vents that directed air upward and out. Courtyards that kept outside air away from patient wards. Some hospitals had windows that were permanently sealed, not because they were broken, but because it was policy. Fresh air was not considered fresh. It was considered foreign, unpredictable, potentially contaminated. And so the window, this simple piece of technology that could have saved lives, became a tool of harm, because keeping it closed felt like protection. Now, there's one particular kind of window I want to talk about. The sick room window. In wealthier homes, when someone got seriously ill, they were often moved to a specific room. A room that could be closed off from the rest of the house. A room where they could be monitored, cared for, isolated. And that room was prepared. The curtains were drawn. Heavy fabric, often dark, to block out light. The window was closed. Latched. Sometimes sealed with cloth to prevent even the smallest draft. The door was kept shut. Visitors were limited. A fire was lit, even in summer, to keep the room warm. The air inside became thick, stale. It smelled like sweat and breath and medicine and sometimes infection. And the person lying in that room, feverish, struggling, often desperately wanted someone to open the window. But they were told no. They were told it was for their own good. And so they suffered, not just from the illness, but from the treatment. The irony is that the window, if opened, could have helped in so many ways. It would have brought in cooler air, which lowers body temperature. It would have increased ventilation, which reduces the concentration of airborne pathogens. It would have brought in light, which has antibacterial properties and helps regulate sleep and mood. It would have made the patient feel less trapped, less suffocated, less like they were already in a tomb. But none of that was understood. The window was feared, and so it stayed closed. Now, there's another object that belongs in this story. The pomander. A pomander was a small ball, usually made of metal, sometimes silver, sometimes gold if you were very wealthy. It had holes punched in it, and inside you stuffed it with herbs, spices, flowers, anything that smelled strong and pleasant. Cloves, lavender, rose petals, cinnamon, ambergris if you could afford it. And you carried it with you. You held it to your nose when you walked through a bad-smelling street, when you visited a sick person, when you went anywhere that you thought miasma might be present. The idea was that the good smell would protect you from the bad smell, that the pleasant aroma would create a kind of shield around you, blocking the corrupt air from entering your body. Doctors carried them. Priests carried them. Wealthy people carried them. And it did absolutely nothing to prevent disease, but made people feel safer. It gave them a sense of control. And in a world where disease felt random and unstoppable, that sense of control mattered, even if it was an illusion. There's a famous image, you have probably seen it, of a plague doctor wearing a long beaked mask. That beak was not decorative. It was functional. At least, it was supposed to be. The beak was stuffed with herbs and flowers and strong-smelling substances. The idea was that the doctor, while treating plague victims, would breathe only through the beak, and the aromatic herbs would filter out the miasma. It did not work, but it was based on the same logic as the pomander. Smell de quoi le danger. Good smell equals protection. And so the mask became a symbol of medicine, a symbol of intervention, a symbol of man trying to fight death with the tools he had, even when those tools were useless. Now let us come back to the window, because the window is not just about air. It is about light. And light, for a long time, was also mistrusted. Not always, not universally, but in the context of sickness, light was often seen as too stimulating, too harsh. A sick person was supposed to rest, to be still, to be calm, and bright light was thought to agitate the system. So curtains were drawn, shutters were closed, patients were kept in dim rooms, which meant they were kept from the sun. And without sunlight, their bodies could not produce vitamin D. And without vitamin D, bones weakened, immune systems faltered, moods darkened. But again, no one made the connection, because the theory said light was overstimulating. And so the curtains stayed closed, and the windows stayed shut, and the gap between inside and outside became a medical rule, a rule that killed quietly, not with drama, not with sudden collapse, but with slow weakening, with infections that should have been survivable, with recoveries that never came. The window could have been a door to healing. Instead, it became a wall. Now let's talk about who got to stay inside and who did not. Because this fear of fresh air, this obsession with sealed rooms and controlled environments, it was never universal. It was a luxury. If you were wealthy, you could afford to follow medical advice. You could afford heavy curtains and closed windows and fires burning all day to keep the room warm. You could afford to rest, to stay in bed, to have someone else do the work while you recovered. But if you were poor, you had no choice. You worked outside. You lived in buildings with broken windows and drafty walls. You could not afford curtains. You could not afford a doctor. And so you were exposed to fresh air, whether you wanted to be or not. And here is the strange, quiet truth that no one wanted to admit. The poor often survive things that kill the rich. Not always. Not reliably. Poverty came with its own horrors. Malnutrition, overwork, injury, lack of access to any care at all. But in terms of respiratory infections, fevers, tuberculosis, the diseases that thrived in stale, enclosed spaces, the poor had an accidental advantage. They were outside. They were breathing, moving air. They were exposed to sunlight. And their bodies, the ones that survived childhood, were often stronger for it. But no doctor saw that as evidence. Because poor people were not studied. They were not written about. They were not considered medically interesting. Medical knowledge came from treating the people who could pay. And the people who could pay were the ones being kept inside. So the data was skewed from the start. Now let's talk about gender. Because women, especially wealthy women, were told to avoid fresh air even more strictly than men. The logic went like this. Women were more delicate, more sensitive, more vulnerable to environmental shocks. Their bodies were thought to be ruled more by emotion than reason, more by humors than will. And therefore, they needed more protection. A man might be told to take a walk for his health, to get some exercise, to spend time outdoors, as long as he avoided swamps and night air. But a woman? A woman was told to rest, to stay indoors, to avoid exertion, especially if she was pregnant, or recovering from childbirth, or menstruating, or just, existing as a woman. The result was that many upper-class women spent most of their lives inside. They did not walk much. They did not see the sun much. They did not breathe fresh air much. And they were often sick. They had headaches, fainting spells, weakness, digestive problems, bone pain, and doctors treated all of that as natural. As part of being a woman, they prescribed bed rest. They prescribed tonics. They prescribed more isolation. And the women got worse. Meanwhile, working-class women, the ones who had to haul water and wash clothes and work in fields and markets, they were outside all the time. And yes, they suffered. They suffered from overwork and poverty and lack of food and lack of rest. But they did not suffer from the same kind of vague, chronic weakness that plagued wealthier women. Because they were moving, they were breathing, they were living in their bodies instead of being told to suppress them. But again, no one studied working-class women. No one wrote medical papers about them. So the pattern went unnoticed. Now let us talk about children again, but this time through the lens of class. If you were a wealthy child, you were kept indoors as much as possible. You had a nursery, a governess, a tutor. You learned to read and write and behave properly. You did not play in the streets. You did not run wild. You did not get dirty. You were pale. You were clean. You were dressed in layers of clothing that made it hard to move. And you were often sick. Coughs, colds, fevers, weak bones, poor appetite. Your parents worried about you constantly. They called doctors. They tried treatments. They prayed. If you were a poor child, you had no nursery. You played outside. You ran. You climbed. You got dirty. You worked, often from a young age, helping your parents, running errands, watching younger siblings. You were exposed to everything. Cold, heat, sun, and many poor children died. From disease, from accidents, from hunger. But the ones who survived were often remarkably sturdy. Their bones were strong. Their lungs were clear. They could run for hours. And yet, if you asked a doctor which child was healthier, he would point to the pale, quiet, indoor child every time. Because that child fit the model of what health was supposed to look like. Controlled, calm, protected. The outdoor child looked wild, unrefined, exposed to danger. Even if that child could outrun, outwork, and outlast the indoor one. Now, there was one group of people who were exposed to fresh air constantly and studied, because of it, sailors. Sailors lived outside. They slept on decks. They worked in all weather. They breathed sea air day and night. And they got sick in specific, predictable ways. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, dysentery from bad water, typhus from lice and crowding below deck. But they did not get the kinds of respiratory illnesses that plague people in cities, because they were breathing fresh, moving air all the time. Naval doctors noticed this. They wrote about it. They recommended that ships be well ventilated, that sailors sleep on deck when possible, that hatches be kept open, and those recommendations worked. But they did not translate to civilian medicine, because the theory said that sea air was different, special, purifying. It was not that fresh air in general was good. It was that sea air specifically had unique properties. And so the lesson was not learned. The windows on land stayed closed, and the people inside kept dying. Because the divide was not just between rich and poor, or men and women, or adults and children. The divide was between the people who made the rules and the people who lived under them. The people who made the rules were educated, wealthy, indoor people, and they built a medical system that reflected their lives. A system that valued control over movement, stillness over activity, enclosure over exposure. And that system served them poorly. But it served the people outside their world even worse. Because those people did not get the choice to ignore the rules. They just got blamed when the rules did not save them. So when did the window finally open? Not all at once. Not with a single discovery. Not with one doctor standing up and saying, "We have been wrong about everything." It happened in pieces, in accidents, in observations made by people who were not supposed to matter. And the first real crack in the theory came from prisons. Which is ironic, is it not? That the truth about healing came from places designed for punishment. But prisons in the 18th century were death traps. They were overcrowded, dark, airless. Men and women and sometimes children packed into cells with no ventilation, no sanitation, no light. People called it jail fever. Jail fever. We know it now as typhus. It spread through prisons like fire. Prisoners died by the dozens. And not just prisoners. Guards died. Lawyers died. Judges died when prisoners were brought into courtrooms. There was a famous case in 1750 at the Old Bailey in London. A trial was held, and several of the people in the courtroom, including the Lord Mayor and 2 judges, contracted fever and died within days. The prisoners had brought the miasma with them. That was the explanation. The bad air from the prison had infected the courtroom, and so the response was to keep prisons even more sealed, to limit movement, to control exposure. A man named John Howard, a prison reformer, started visiting prisons across England and Europe in the 1770s. He was not a doctor. He was a philanthropist, a religious man who believed in improving conditions for prisoners. And he noticed something. The prisons with the highest death rates were the ones with the least ventilation. The ones with small windows or no windows, or windows that had been sealed shut. The ones where the air was so thick you could barely breathe. And the prisons with lower death rates, the ones where fewer people died of fever, were the ones with better airflow. Larger windows, open courtyards, spaces where air could move. Howard published a book in 1777 called The State of the Prisons in England and Wales. In it, he argued that ventilation was critical, that fresh air could reduce disease, that keeping prisoners in sealed, stagnant spaces was killing them. He did not have germ theory. He still believed in miasma, actually, but he had flipped the logic. He thought that the bad air was not coming from outside. It was building up inside. And the solution was not to seal the room. It was to let the air move, to let the bad air escape and the fresh air come in. This was radical, and it was not immediately accepted. But Howard had data. He had visited hundreds of prisons. He had recorded death rates. He had compared conditions. And his book was read. It was discussed. It influenced policy. Slowly, some prisons began to be redesigned. Windows were added. Courtyards were built. Ventilation became part of the architectural plan. And death rates dropped. Not completely. Not everywhere. But enough that people noticed. Enough that some doctors started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, fresh air was not the enemy. Now, around the same time, something else was happening. The British Navy was running experiments. Not on purpose. Not as formal research. But they were trying to solve a problem, and in solving it, they stumbled onto a truth. Ships were disease factories. Men lived in close quarters below deck. The air was stale. The space was damp. Disease spread fast, and naval officers were desperate to keep their crews alive, not out of compassion necessarily, but out of necessity. You cannot sail a ship if half your crew is dead. So, some captains started experimenting with ventilation. They installed wind sails, devices that funneled fresh air below deck. They required hatches to be kept open when weather allowed. They had men sleep on deck when possible. And they noticed improvements. Fewer fevers. Fewer deaths from typhus. A physician named James Lind, who is more famous for figuring out that citrus prevents scurvy, also wrote about the importance of ventilation on ships. In 1757, he published an essay on the most effectual means of preserving the health of seamen. And in it, he argued that fresh air was essential, that the practice of sealing men below deck in storms was killing them. That ventilation saved lives. Again, he was still working within miasma theory. He thought that fresh air diluted the bad air, that it dispersed the corrupt vapors. But the recommendation was the same: open the hatches. Let the air move. And it worked. The Navy started to adopt these practices. Not everywhere, not immediately, but gradually, ventilation became part of naval medicine. And the men who served on well-ventilated ships survived at higher rates than the men on sealed ones. This was observable, repeatable. It created a body of evidence. But it still did not translate to civilian hospitals, because the Navy was different. Ships were different. Sea air was different. That is what the medical establishment said. And so the lesson, once again, stayed contained. But the cracks were forming. Now, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, There was a growing romantic movement in art and literature. Poets and painters started to celebrate nature, to talk about the beauty of the outdoors, the healing power of mountains and forests and oceans. William Wordsworth wrote about wandering through the countryside, about the restorative power of natural landscapes. John Keats, before he died of tuberculosis, wrote about the sensory richness of the world, the smell of flowers, the feel of wind. This was not science. This was art, but it was shifting the culture. It was making the idea of fresh air feel less dangerous and more desirable. And some doctors began to notice. There was a physician named Thomas Beddoes who, in the 1790s, started experimenting with different kinds of air as treatments. He believed that breathing specific gases could cure diseases. He built a pneumatic institution where patients inhaled things like oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrous oxide. Most of his treatments did not work. Some were ridiculous. Nitrous oxide, laughing gas, just made people giddy. But Beddoes also recommended that his patients spend time outdoors, that they breathe fresh country air, that they take walks. And some of them got better, not because of the gases, but because they were moving, breathing, getting sunlight. Beddoes did not realize that, but he was part of shift, a slow, inconsistent, fragmented shift toward the idea that maybe the outside world was not poison. Then came the tuberculosis problem. Tuberculosis, consumption, the White Plague, it killed more people in the 19th century than any other disease. It wasted people away, made them pale, thin, feverish. It filled their lungs with fluid. It made them cough blood, and no one knew how to stop it. Doctors tried everything: bleeding, purging, tonics, rest, and people kept dying. But there were stories, anecdotes, whispers, stories of people who went to the countryside and got better, who moved to the mountains and recovered, who spent time outside and seemed to improve. And some doctors started to pay attention. One of them was a German physician named Hermann Bremer. In the 1850s, Bremer had tuberculosis himself. He was told to rest, to stay indoors, to follow the standard treatment. But he did not. He went hiking in the mountains. He spent time outside. He breathed cold, fresh air, and he got better. He did not cure himself. Tuberculosis is tricky. Some people recover on their own. Some go into remission. But Bremer believed that the fresh air and the altitude had healed him. And so he built a sanatorium, a treatment facility in the mountains where tuberculosis patients could rest outdoors. He had them sleep on open porches, eat meals outside, spend hours lying in the sun, wrapped in blankets, breathing mountain air. And some of them got better. Not all, not even most, but some. And that was enough to make people pay attention, because for the first time, there was a treatment that seemed to work better than the sealed room. Other doctors started building sanatoriums in Switzerland, in Austria, in the United States, all of them based on the same idea: fresh air, sunlight, rest. And slowly, very slowly, the medical consensus began to shift. Not because of one study, not because someone discovered germs yet, that was still coming, but because the evidence was piling up. Prisons with ventilation had lower death rates. Ships with fresh air had healthier crews. Sanatoriums in the mountains helped tuberculosis patients. And the old theory, the one that said fresh air was deadly, was starting to crack. It had not broken yet. It was still taught, still defended, still practiced in many hospitals. But the certainty was gone. And once certainty is gone, change becomes possible. Let's slow down for a moment. Let's talk about ritual, about repetition, about the things people did every day without questioning why. Because medical belief is not just about what doctors think. It is about what ordinary people do. And for centuries, ordinary people repeated the same patterns. When someone got sick, you closed the windows. You drew the curtains. You kept the room warm. You kept the patient still. This was not written in a manual that every household owned. It was passed down, mother to daughter, father to son, neighbor to neighbor. It was what you did, what everyone did, and doing it felt like care, felt like love. If you did not close the window, if you let the cold air in and the person got worse, you would blame yourself. You would think, I should have kept them warmer. I should have protected them. And so you repeated the ritual, because the ritual gave you something to do, gave you a sense of control in the face of something terrifying. Sickness, especially serious sickness, makes people feel helpless. You cannot see what is happening inside the body. You cannot fight it with your hands. You cannot reason with it. All you can do is follow the rules. Do what you have been told. Hope that it works. And closing the window was one of those rules. A simple action, a clear boundary. Inside is safe. Outside is danger. You shut the window, and you have done something. You have taken a step. You have protected the person you love, even if that step is actually hurting them. Now, think about the rhythm of this. Every day, someone in the household checks the window. Make sure it is latched. Every morning, the curtains stay closed. Every evening, the fire is stoked to keep the room warm. Meals are brought in. A bowl of broth. A piece of bread. The patient eats a little, or if it does not eat at all. The person caring for them wipes their forehead, changes the sheets, empties the chamber pot, and the window stays closed. Day after day, week after week, this repetition creates a kind of trance, a rhythm that feels almost sacred. You're doing everything you are supposed to do. You are following the procedure. You're being a good caretaker. And when the person recovers, you feel relief. You feel like the ritual worked. You kept them safe. You kept the bad air out. And when the person dies, you feel guilt. You wonder if you missed something, if you opened the window by accident, if you let the danger in. Either way, the belief holds. Because a ritual is not really about logic. It is about meaning. It is about having something to hold on to when everything else feels like chaos. Now, there were other rituals too. Smaller ones, quieter ones. The pomade we talked about earlier. Carrying it, holding it to your nose when you pass something that smelled bad. That was a ritual. A gesture repeated so many times it became automatic. You did not think about it. You just did it. And it made you feel safer, even though it did nothing. Or the practice of burning herbs in a sick room. Rosemary, lavender, juniper. You would light a small bundle and let the smoke fill the room. Let it cover the smell of sweat and sickness. And you believed that the smoke was purifying the air, driving out the miasma. It was not, but it gave you something to do, a task, a ritual. And rituals, even useless ones, provide comfort. There is also the ritual of the doctor's visit. If you could afford it, you called for a doctor when someone was very sick. And the doctor arrived with his bag, his dark coat, his serious expression. He examined the patient, felt the pulse, looked at the tone, asked questions, and then he gave instructions. Keep the room warm. Keep the patient still. Give them this tonic. Bleed them if the fever spikes. And you followed those instructions. Because the doctor was the authority, the expert. He had been trained. He had read the books. He knew things you did not. And so you trusted him. You did what he said, even when it did not help, even when the patient got worse. Because what else could you do? The alternative was to do nothing, to admit that you were powerless, that no one really knew how to fix this. And that was too frightening. So you kept following the ritual, kept closing the window, kept drawing the curtains, kept hoping. And the ritual became part of the culture. It became part of how people understood sickness and health. It became invisible, automatic, unquestioned, until someone questioned it. But questioning a ritual is hard, because a ritual is not just a practice. It is a belief system. It is tied to identity, to community, to the way things have always been done. And when you challenge a ritual, you are not just challenging an action. You are challenging the people who taught you that action. Your parents, your grandparents, your neighbors, your doctor. You are saying, Maybe they were wrong. Maybe we have all been wrong. And that is uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable. So even when evidence started to appear that fresh air might be good, that sunlight might help, that open windows might save lives, people resisted. Not because they were stupid, but because the ritual had meaning. It had history. It had emotional weight. And letting go of it meant letting go of a kind of certainty. A certainty that even if you could not cure the person you loved, at least you were doing the right things. At least you were trying. At least you were not making it worse. Except, of course, you were. But you did not know that. And no one blamed you. Because everyone was doing the same thing. Everyone was following the same ritual. And the ritual felt like care. Felt like wisdom. Felt like the only thing standing between your loved one and death. Even when it was the thing pushing them closer to it. Let us talk about what it actually feels like to be sick. Not the idea of sickness. Not the theory. But the physical reality. Because that is what all of this comes back to. Bodies. Human bodies that are fragile and mortal and trying desperately to survive. When you have a high fever, your body is fighting something. An infection, a virus, bacteria, something that does not belong. And the fever is part of the fight. Your body raises its temperature to make the environment hostile to whatever is invading you. But fever also makes you miserable. You are hot. Your skin burns. You sweat through your clothes, through your sheets. And then suddenly you are cold, shivering. Your teeth chatter. You pull blankets over yourself even though you are still burning up. You cannot think clearly. Your head aches. Your muscles ache. Everything aches. You are thirsty, but drinking makes you nauseous. You are exhausted, but you cannot sleep. You drift in and out. You have strange dreams. You wake up not knowing where you are. And in that state, you are vulnerable. You cannot take care of yourself. You need someone else to bring you water, to change your sheets, to help you sit up. You trust that person. You have to. And if that person tells you that the window must stay closed, you believe them. Because you do not have the strength to argue. You do not have the clarity to question. You just lie there, hot, suffocating, wishing the air was cooler, but not knowing that it could be. Now, imagine you are that sick person, and you are lying in a room in summer. The windows are closed. The curtains are drawn. There is a fire burning because the doctor said to keep you warm. The air is thick. It barely moves. You can smell yourself. You can smell the sweat and the sickness and the sheets that have not been changed in days. You want to ask someone to open the window. You want to feel a breeze, just a little bit of coolness. But you have been told it is dangerous, that the night air will make you worse. So you stay quiet. You endure. And your body, which is already struggling, now has to fight in an environment with less oxygen, more heat, more stagnant air. Your breathing gets harder. Your heart works faster. Your immune system, which needs energy, has less to work with. And you get worse. Not because of the disease alone, but because of the conditions. And no one realizes it. Because everyone thinks the closed room is helping. Now let us talk about tuberculosis specifically. Because tuberculosis was the biggest killer of the 19th century. And it killed slowly. It started with a cough. A persistent cough that would not go away. Then fatigue. You got tired easily. You lost weight. You lost your appetite. Then night sweats. You would wake up drenched, freezing, even though you had been burning up moments before. Then the coughing got worse. You started coughing up blood. Just a little at first. Then more. Your lungs filled with fluid. Breathing became hard. Every breath was work. And over months, sometimes years, you wasted away. You became pale, thin, weak. Your eyes looked too large for your face. Your cheekbones jutted out. People called it consumption because it looked like the disease was consuming you from the inside. And the standard treatment was rest. Indoors, in a closed room, away from fresh air, which was exactly the wrong thing. Because tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that spreads through the air, through tiny droplets when an infected person coughs. And in a closed room, those droplets stay in the air. They settle on surfaces. They get breathed in by anyone else in the room. So keeping a tuberculosis patient in a sealed space did not just fail to help them. It infected everyone around them. Family members got sick. Caretakers got sick. Whole households were wiped out. And doctors blamed it on heredity, on weak constitutions, on miasma. They did not realize that the room itself was the transmission point, that the very thing they thought was protecting people was killing them. Now, here is what actually helps with tuberculosis. Fresh air, moving air, sunlight. Not because those things cure the infection. They do not. Tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, and you need antibiotics to kill bacteria, and antibiotics were not invented until the 20th century. But fresh air reduces transmission. It dilutes the concentration of bacteria in the air. It makes it harder for the disease to spread. Sunlight has antibacterial properties. Ultraviolet light kills tuberculosis bacteria on surfaces, and rest outdoors in a place with good airflow gives your immune system the best possible chance to fight the infection on its own. Some people's immune systems could do that. Not everyone, but some. And those were the people who survived in the sanatoriums. Not because of medicine, but because of environment. They were given what their bodies needed. Air, light, rest, food, and some of them healed. But before the sanatoriums, before anyone figured this out, people just died. They died in dark rooms, alone or surrounded by family who were also getting sick. They died believing they had done everything right, followed all the rules, and in a way they had. They had followed the rules perfectly. The rules were just wrong. Now, let's talk about childbirth, because childbirth was another area where the fear of fresh air caused harm. When a woman gave birth, she was often kept in a closed room for weeks afterward. This was called lying in, a period of rest and recovery. The room was kept warm. The windows were kept shut. Visitors were limited. The idea was that the woman was weak after childbirth, vulnerable, in need of protection, and fresh air, especially cold air, was considered dangerous. It could cause a chill, a fever, an infection, so the room was sealed, and the woman lay there, recovering from the intense physical trauma of labor in a hot, airless space. And infections happened. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, a bacterial infection that entered through the wounds left by childbirth. It caused fever, pain, delirium, and it killed quickly. Thousands of women died from it, tens of thousands, and doctors did not know why. They thought it was miasma, bad air, corrupt vapors. They did not realize that the infection was being spread by doctors themselves, by unwashed hands, by instruments that were not sterilized. And they did not realize that the sealed room made it worse, because the bacteria thrived in warm, still environments, and the woman, already weakened, had no chance. Now, there are some doctors who notice patterns. A Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s noticed that women who gave birth at home had lower death rates from puerperal fever than women who gave birth in hospitals. And he noticed that in hospitals, the doctors who performed autopsies in the morning and then delivered babies in the afternoon had higher rates of infection in their patients. So he made a wild suggestion: wash your hands. Wash your hands with chlorinated lime between patients, between autopsies and deliveries. And when doctors did that, death rates dropped dramatically. But Semmelweis was mocked, ridiculed, dismissed, because the idea that doctors were causing the infections was insulting. Offensive. Doctors were gentlemen, educated men. They could not be the source of disease. And besides, miasma theory said that infection came from bad air, not from touch. So Semmelweis's discovery was ignored, and women kept dying, and the windows stayed closed, because no one connected the dots. No one saw that the sealed room, the lack of ventilation, the stale air, all of it was making things worse. They saw death and they doubled down on the old rules. More warmth, more enclosure, more protection, which meant more death. And the cycle continued until finally, slowly, the paradigm began to shift, not because of one revelation, but because the evidence became impossible to ignore. People who spent time outside were healthier. Sailors with ventilation survived. Prisoners with fresh air lived longer. Tuberculosis patients in sanatoriums recovered. And the old belief, the one that had held for so long, began to collapse. But it did not collapse easily. And it did not collapse quietly. It fought back. It resisted. It clung to authority and tradition and fear. Because letting go of that belief meant admitting that generations of doctors had been wrong, that countless people had died because of advice that was supposed to save them. And that is a heavy truth to carry. By the middle of the 19th century, the world was moving faster than it ever had before. Not just in ideas, in everything. Steam engines were pulling trains across continents. Factories were replacing workshops. Cities were doubling and tripling in size within a single generation. London in 1850 had more than 2 million people. Paris was not far behind. New York was growing so fast that entire neighborhoods appeared in the time it took to build a single house. And with all of that growth came a problem that could not be ignored anymore. Disease. Not the quiet, individual disease of one person lying in a sealed room, but mass disease, epidemic disease, disease that swept through entire cities in weeks and killed thousands before anyone could even begin to understand what was happening. Cholera. If you want to understand why the belief about fresh air finally started to break apart, you have to understand cholera. Cholera came in waves. Great rolling epidemics that started somewhere in Asia and traveled west along trade routes until they hit Europe and then crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. It killed fast, terrifyingly fast. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. The disease caused violent diarrhea and vomiting that drained the body of fluid so rapidly that people became dehydrated within hours. Their skin turned gray and loose. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Their voices became hoarse. And then they died. In 1832, cholera killed more than 50,000 people in Britain alone. In 1849, it came back and killed more. In 1854, it came again. And the medical establishment was struggling because cholera did not fit neatly into miasma theory. It appeared in poor neighborhoods, yes. It appeared near sewage and garbage, yes. But it also appeared in places that smelled fine. It appeared in houses that seemed clean. It appeared in people who had been nowhere near a swamp. And it killed people who followed all the rules, who stayed inside, who avoided the night air, who did everything a doctor told them. So something was wrong with the theory. And a man named John Snow decided to find out what. John Snow was a London physician. Quiet. Methodical, not particularly interested in fame. But in 1854, when cholera hit the Soho neighborhood of London and killed more than 500 people in 10 days, he started asking questions. He walked through the neighborhood. He talked to residents. He mapped every case. He marked every death on a grid. And he noticed a pattern. Nearly every death was clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. People who drank from that pump got sick. People who did not, did not. He found a brewery nearby where the workers had not gotten sick because they drank beer, not water from the pump. He found a woman who lived far from the neighborhood but had died of cholera. Her family said she had liked the taste of the Broad Street water and had water sent to her from it regularly. Snow went to the local authorities and convinced them to remove the handle from the pump. The outbreak slowed, and Snow published his findings. He argued that cholera was spread through contaminated water, not through the air, not through miasma, through water. This was revolutionary, but it was not immediately accepted. The medical establishment pushed back. They said it was still miasma. that the smell of the sewage-contaminated water was what made people sick, not the water itself. They could not quite bring themselves to abandon the theory entirely. But Snow's work planted a seed, a very important seed, because it shifted the focus from air to something else, from what you breathe to what you touch, what you drink, what your hands carry. And that shift, that tiny, difficult, resisted shift, was the beginning of germ theory. Around the same time, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur was running experiments on fermentation. He was trying to figure out why wine and beer sometimes went bad, and he discovered that it was caused by tiny living organisms, microorganisms, things so small you could not see them without a microscope. Pasteur proposed that these microorganisms were responsible not just for fermentation, but for disease. That disease was not caused by bad air. It was caused by living things, things that could be transmitted, that could travel from person to person. Germ theory. A German physician named Robert Koch took this further. In the 1870s and 1880s, Koch identified the specific bacteria that caused tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. He could see them under a microscope. He could grow them in a laboratory. He could prove definitively that they caused disease. And suddenly, everything changed. If disease was caused by bacteria, then the whole framework of miasma was wrong. Bad smells did not cause disease. Bacteria caused disease. Fresh air did not carry poison. Stagnant, contaminated spaces allowed bacteria to breed and spread. Open windows did not let danger in. They let it out. The thing that killed people was not the breeze. It was the invisible organism that thrived in the very conditions doctors had been creating. Closed rooms, sealed sick rooms, still air where bacteria could multiply and spread. But this knowledge did not change medical practice overnight, because knowledge never does. There were doctors who accepted germ theory immediately, who saw the evidence and completely revised how they thought about disease. And there were doctors who spent the rest of their careers defending miasma, who called Pasteur and Koch dangerous radicals, who said that their experiments proved nothing. The transition took decades. But while the doctors were arguing, something else was happening. The cities were changing. The public health movement, driven partly by concern about cholera and partly by the growing evidence of germ theory, started to reshape how cities were built and managed. In London, a massive sewer system was constructed under the city. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette built more than 1,000 miles of underground sewers that redirected waste away from the Thames and out to sea. The smell improved. The water became cleaner, and cholera rates dropped, not because anyone fully understood germ theory yet, but because the conditions that allowed bacteria to spread were reduced. In Paris, the entire city was redesigned. Baron Haussmann tore down medieval alleys and replaced them with wide boulevards. Part of the reason was aesthetic. Part was political, but part was public health. Wide streets meant more air movement, more light, less concentrated filth. In New York, the Croton Aqueduct brought clean water to the city. Death rates fell. In cities across Europe and America, governments started requiring that new buildings have windows, have ventilation, have access to light and air. Building codes began to reflect what evidence was slowly, painfully proving, that fresh air and sunlight were not the enemy. They were essential. And in hospitals, things started to change too. Florence Nightingale was not a doctor. She was a nurse, but she was one of the most important figures in the history of medicine. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, she went to military hospitals in what is now Turkey and found conditions that horrified her. Overcrowded, dark, filthy, no ventilation, soldiers lying in their own waste, infections spreading everywhere. She reorganized everything. She opened windows. She improved ventilation. She cleaned the wards. She brought in fresh food. She improved sanitation. And death rates fell from 40% to 2% in 6 months. She was still thinking partly in terms of miasma. She believed that clean air dispersed bad vapors. She did not yet have germ theory, but she was right about the interventions. And she went home to England and spent the rest of her life advocating for hospital design that prioritized light, ventilation, and cleanliness. Her influence on hospital architecture was enormous. Hospitals started to be built with large windows, with cross-ventilation, with open wards where air could move freely. The sealed sick room was starting to lose its hold. And then, in 1903, a Danish scientist named Niels Finsen won the Nobel Prize for using light to cure disease. Specifically, he had used ultraviolet light to treat lupus vulgaris, a form of tuberculosis that affects the skin. He had taken something that doctors had feared for centuries, direct light on the skin, and proved that it could heal, that it killed bacteria, that it was medicine. And with that, the last pillar of the old belief began to crumble. Not fall, crumble. Slowly, unevenly. But the direction was clear. Fresh air and sunshine were not killers. They were, and always had been, part of what kept people alive. Now here is where it gets interesting in a different way. Because once the science flipped, once fresh air and sunlight became officially good, something strange happened. We overcorrected, and then we got confused again, and then we invented entirely new myths to replace the old ones. Because that is what humans do. We do not just update our beliefs calmly and rationally. We swing. We overcorrect. We take something we were afraid of and turn it into a cure-all. We take something we once celebrated and turn it into a danger. And the story of fresh air and sunshine is one of the best examples of this pattern that history has to offer. Let's start with the sanatorium craze. Once the tuberculosis sanatoriums started showing results, once fresh air and sunlight were associated with healing, they became fashionable. And when something becomes fashionable, it stops being medicine and becomes something else entirely. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sanatoriums were everywhere. In Switzerland, in the Alps, in the American Southwest, in the mountains of upstate New York. And they were not just for tuberculosis anymore. They were for nerves, for exhaustion, for what doctors called neurasthenia, a vague diagnosis that basically meant you were tired and overwhelmed by modern life. Wealthy people went to sanatoriums not because they were dying, but because they needed a break. They sat in deck chairs wrapped in blankets. They breathed mountain air. They ate simple food. They rested, and they called it a cure. The actual therapeutic value was real in some ways. Rest is good. Clean air is good. Time away from overcrowded cities is good. But the sanatorium also became a status symbol, a vacation dressed up as medicine. Rich people went to Switzerland to recover from the stress of being rich. And the doctors who ran these places, who charged enormous fees for fresh air and sunshine, became wealthy themselves. Thomas Mann wrote a novel about it, The Magic Mountain, published in 1924. A young man goes to visit his cousin in a Swiss sanatorium and ends up staying for 7 years. Because the sanatorium had become a world unto itself, a bubble, a place where wealthy invalids lived in a kind of suspended animation, neither quite sick nor quite well. And man was sharp enough to see the irony, the comedy, the way that fresh air and rest had been transformed from basic human needs into luxury products. That is the first modern distortion, taking something simple and making it expensive. Now, let us talk about the sunshine craze. Once Niels Finsen won his Nobel Prize for light therapy, once the connection between sunlight and health became established, the culture went slightly mad about it. In the 1920s and 1930s, sunbathing became fashionable. And not just fashionable, it was medical. Doctors prescribed it. They called it heliotherapy. They had patients sit in the sun for prescribed periods. They tracked their tan lines and called it progress. Coco Chanel, the fashion designer, got a tan while on a yacht in the French Riviera around 1923, and because she was Coco Chanel, suddenly tan skin was fashionable. This was a complete reversal of centuries of status symbolism. Pale skin had meant wealth, protection, sophistication. Now tan skin meant wealth, leisure, the ability to travel to places with sun. The same body, the same melanin, the same sunlight. But the meaning flipped completely, and doctors, happy to be associated with something fashionable, enthusiastically prescribed sun exposure. Tuberculosis patients were told to sunbathe. Children with rickets were told to sunbathe. People with skin conditions were told to sunbathe. Some of that was genuinely helpful, but some of it went too far. People sunbathed for hours, for entire days, without protection, and skin cancer rates started to rise. Now here's the thing. The sun does cause skin cancer. That is true. The ultraviolet radiation that kills bacteria on surfaces also damages DNA and skin cells if you get too much of it. But the medical community, having swung from sunlight is dangerous to sunlight is medicine, now had to swing back again. And by the late 20th century, the message was, wear sunscreen. Avoid the midday sun. Cover up, which was, again, overcorrected. Because now people were avoiding sunlight so carefully that vitamin D deficiency became a widespread problem. Doctors started finding patients with extremely low vitamin D levels. People who lived in northern climates. People who worked indoors. People who wore heavy sunscreen every time they went outside. And vitamin D deficiency, it turns out, is connected to bone disease, immune dysfunction, depression, and increased risk of certain cancers. So we went from sunlight is poison to sunlight is medicine to sunlight causes cancer to lack of sunlight causes other cancers. Full circle. Almost. But each time we turned, we created a new myth, a new certainty, a new belief that felt obvious and unquestionable until someone showed it was incomplete. Now let us talk about fresh air in the modern world. Because fresh air has had its own complicated journey through pop culture. In the 20th century, as cities grew and factories multiplied, the air in many places actually became dangerous. Not because of miasma, but because of pollution, smog, industrial emissions, car exhaust. In London in 1952, a combination of cold weather, coal smoke, and fog created what became known as the Great Smog. It lasted 5 days and killed anywhere from 4,000 to 12,000 people, depending on which estimate you use. And suddenly, fresh air was not just a health concept. It was a political issue. Clean Air Acts were passed. Factories were regulated. Car emissions were controlled. And in the public imagination, fresh air became something you had to fight for. Something that was being taken away by industry and profit. The environmental movement took it up. Fresh air became a symbol of nature versus industry, of health versus greed. And that is not wrong. Air quality matters enormously. But it created a new complication. Because now when people talked about fresh air, they meant something different depending on where they stood politically. To some, fresh air meant environmental regulation, government protection, science-based policy. To others, it meant freedom, the countryside, getting away from the city, individual choice. And the simple truth that moving air is healthier than stagnant air got buried under layers of politics and ideology. Then came the internet. And with the internet came a spectacular explosion of misinformation about air, breathing, light, and health. Suddenly, everyone was an expert. You could find websites claiming that breathing outside air in cities was worse than smoking, that sunlight was categorically dangerous and you should never expose your skin to it, that certain kinds of light from screens were more dangerous than ultraviolet radiation. You could find other websites claiming that sunscreen was a conspiracy, that vitamin D deficiency was being hidden from the public, that doctors wanted you to stay inside so you would buy more medicine. Both extremes, both wrong, both drawing on the same ancient human pattern: fear of the invisible. The medieval doctor who sealed the sickroom window because he feared miasma, and the internet commenter who tells you that city air will give you cancer within years are not as different as they might seem. Both are trying to make sense of an invisible threat. Both are working with incomplete information. Both are afraid, and both, in their fear, are reaching for certainty in a world that does not offer much. There's also the way popular culture has romanticized the sanatorium era. Movies set in the early 20th century often show beautiful pale people in mountain resorts, wrapped in white blankets, coughing elegantly into handkerchiefs while looking dramatically at alpine scenery. There is something almost glamorous about the way tuberculosis is portrayed in film. Moulin Rouge, La Bohème, stories where consumption is poetic, where the wasting away is beautiful, which is, frankly, an insult to the millions of people who died gasping and suffering and afraid. But romanticization is part of how pop culture handles history it does not fully understand. It takes something complex and brutal and makes it aesthetic. And in doing so, it loses the truth. The truth is that tuberculosis was terrifying, that the sealed rooms killed as surely as the bacteria, that the people who suffered in them were not glamorous. They were desperate, and the doctors who kept those rooms sealed were not villains in a movie. They were frightened human beings trying to help, using the best knowledge they had, which was wrong. And now we know it was wrong. But do we know which of our current certainties are also wrong? That is the question worth sitting with as you lie here tonight. So why did this belief survive for so long? Why did the idea that fresh air and sunshine were dangerous last for centuries, across continents, across cultures, across generations of educated, intelligent, well-meaning people? That is the real question. Not just what the belief was, but why it had such staying power. And the answer, when you look at it closely, is not really about stupidity. It is not about ignorance, at least not the careless kind. It is about something more fundamental, something more human. It survived because it was useful. Not useful in the sense of being true, but useful in the sense of giving people something to hold on to, something to do, something to believe in when the alternative was admitting that you were helpless. Think about what it would mean to abandon the belief entirely. If you said, honestly and openly, that you had no idea why people got sick, no idea how to treat fever, no idea how to stop the spread of disease, you'd have nothing. No treatment plan, no instructions, no ritual, just terror. And terror without direction is unbearable. So the belief, even a wrong one, provided structure, provided action, provided the feeling that the situation was, at least in part, under control. Close the window. There, you have done something. Draw the curtains. There, you have protected someone you love. Keep the room warm. There, you have followed the rules. You have been a good caretaker. You have done everything you were supposed to do. And if it does not work, at least you tried. That psychological function is enormously powerful. It is not unique to this belief. It appears everywhere in human history, in every culture, in every era. When people do not understand why bad things happen, they create explanations. And they create rituals around those explanations. And those rituals become institutionalized. And then they become nearly impossible to uproot, because uprooting them means not just admitting the explanation was wrong, but dismantling the entire structure of comfort and control that was built on it. The belief in miasma also survived because it was partially right. And partial truths are far more dangerous than complete falsehoods, because a complete falsehood is easy to disprove. But a partial truth keeps confounding you. Miasma theory said that bad environments make you sick. That is true. It said that sewage and rot and filth are connected to disease. That is true. It said that cities with poor sanitation have higher death rates. That is true. It was just wrong about why. And because it kept landing on true observations, even with a wrong explanation, it kept producing plausible results. When cities cleaned up their sewage, death rates fell. Miasma doctors thought they had driven away the bad air. In reality, they had reduced bacterial contamination of water and food. When hospitals improved ventilation, infection rates dropped. Miasma doctors thought they had diluted the corrupt vapors. In reality, they had reduced airborne transmission of bacteria. The interventions worked, just not for the reasons the doctors believed. And when an intervention works, even for the wrong reason, you do not question the theory. You confirm it. This is one of the most important lessons in the history of science. Not just in medicine. Everywhere. When an action seems to produce a result, we assume we understand the connection. But we might be right about what to do and completely wrong about why. And that gap between doing the right thing for the wrong reason can trap you for a very long time. Because you never actually understand the mechanism. You never actually figure out the truth. You just keep doing the thing that seems to work and calling it confirmed. Until the day it stops working. Until the day the intervention fails. Until the day someone asks the right question and the whole explanation falls apart. The belief also survived because it served social functions beyond medicine. It reinforced class structures, keeping wealthy people indoors, protecting them from the common air. The air that poor people breathed was a way of marking difference, of saying, we're not like them. We are more delicate, more refined, more worth protecting. And that kind of social reinforcement is very hard to challenge. Because challenging it does not just mean questioning a medical theory. It means questioning the social order. Saying that poor people who live and work outside might actually be healthier in some ways than wealthy people who stay indoors. That was almost socially unacceptable because it implied that poverty had advantages, that wealth and refinement were not always better. And that kind of idea threatens people who have built their identity and their status on being protected and pampered. So it was resisted, not with scientific arguments, with social ones, with dismissal, with ridicule, with a gentle but firm insistence that some people simply did not understand how the world worked. The belief survived also because the people who questioned it did so imperfectly. The early advocates for fresh air and sunlight were often not scientists. They were reformers, romantics, idealists. They said things like, nature heals. The outdoors is where humans belong. The city is poison. And while those ideas contained truth, they were expressed in ways that made them easy to dismiss. Because they sounded emotional, unscientific, like the opinions of people who simply preferred the countryside to the city, not like rigorous medical claims. And so the medical establishment could wave them away, could say, yes, very nice, very poetic, but we have data. We have centuries of clinical experience. We have Galen and Hippocrates and the entire tradition of Western medicine. What do you have? A feeling? It took Pasteur. It took Koch. It took Snow. It took Nightingale's statistics. It took Finson's Nobel Prize. It took institutional, scientific, repeatable, peer-reviewed evidence before the belief finally could not hold anymore. And even then, it died slowly, unevenly, in some places more quickly than others, with some doctors accepting the new truth immediately and others defending the old one until the end of their careers. Because that is how beliefs work, especially beliefs that are tied to identity, to authority, to the way you have built your entire professional life. You do not just let them go. You hold on, even when the evidence says otherwise, even when the windows finally, mercifully start to open. So let us zoom out now. Let us step back from the sealed rooms and the pomanders and the tuberculosis sanatoriums and the Nobel Prizes and look at the whole shape of this story from a distance. Because when you look at it from far enough away, this is not really a story about medicine. It is a story about fear, and about what fear does to intelligence. Because every person in this story was intelligent. Galen was brilliant. The physicians who built elaborate miasma maps were careful and observant. The doctors who kept windows sealed were thoughtful and concerned. They were not failing because they were stupid. They were failing because they were afraid. Afraid of the invisible. Afraid of the uncontrollable. Afraid of a world that kept killing people in patterns that made no sense. And fear, when it is big enough and old enough and institutional enough, can make intelligence work backwards. It can take careful observation and lead it to the wrong conclusion. It can take genuine concern and channel it into harmful action. It can take the desire to help and transform it into a system that hurts. And the terrifying thing is that it does not feel like fear while it's happening. It feels like knowledge. It feels like certainty. It feels like expertise, and that is perhaps the deepest truth this story holds. The most dangerous beliefs are not the ones that feel uncertain. They're the ones that feel obvious. The ones that feel so self-evident, so universally accepted, so deeply embedded in the texture of daily life, that questioning them feels not just wrong, but absurd. Of course you close the window when someone is sick. Of course you protect a sick person from the cold night air. Of course you keep a feverish child away from the sun. These things felt obvious. They felt like common sense. And common sense, it turns out, is often just collective habit wearing the mask of wisdom. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean for us? What does it mean right now, tonight? Lying wherever you are in a world that has microscopes and vaccines and antibiotics and germ theory. It means something uncomfortable. It means that we almost certainly have our own sealed windows. Our own versions of the belief that felt so obviously right that we stopped questioning it. Our own miasma theories, dressed up in modern language, backed by modern data, taught in modern schools. I am not saying this to make you anxious. I am saying it because it is true, and because history demands that we take it seriously. Every generation of humans has believed things that the next generation would look back on with disbelief. Not because people got stupider, not because the earlier generations were careless, but because knowledge is incomplete. Always, in every era, in every field, and the things we do not know yet are invisible to us, just like bacteria were invisible to the doctors who sealed sickroom windows. We do not know what we do not know, and that is both the most frustrating and the most liberating truth in the history of human thought. Frustrating because it means we cannot fully trust our own certainties. Liberating because it means that every time we discover we were wrong, we have the chance to do better. Now, there's another human truth buried in this story. It is about the relationship between power and knowledge. The belief that fresh air was deadly did not survive just because people were afraid. It survived because it was protected by institutions, by guilds and universities and royal colleges and professional associations. And those institutions were not neutral. They had interests. They had hierarchies. They had reputations to protect. And so, when the truth started to emerge, when the evidence started to mount, the first response was not curiosity. It was defense, because the truth was threatening. Not just intellectually threatening, economically threatening, socially threatening, professionally threatening. If fresh air and sunlight could heal, what did that say about all the expensive treatments that have been prescribed for centuries? What did that say about the doctors who had prescribed them? What did that say about the families who had paid for them? The truth, in this case, was an accusation. And that is why it took so long to be heard. Because the people who needed to hear it were also the people who had the most to lose by accepting it. And that pattern, the pattern where the people with power over knowledge are also the people with the most incentive to resist change in that knowledge. That pattern is also not unique to this story. It appears everywhere, in every field, in every era. It is one of the most reliable features of human institutional life. Not a conspiracy, not deliberate cruelty, just the very human tendency to protect what you have built, to defend what you have believed, to keep the window closed because opening it would let in too much. Now, there's a third human truth here, and it is a gentler one. It is about care, because underneath all of this, underneath the wrong theories and the sealed rooms and the drawn curtains, there was love. The mother who closed the window was not trying to hurt her child. She was trying to protect her child. The doctor who sealed the sick room was not being cruel. He was being careful. The institution that defended miasma theory was not evil. It was trying to preserve what it believed was healing knowledge. And that matters. Because when we look back at history with contempt, when we shake our heads at the foolishness of the past, we miss something essential. We miss the love that was tangled up in the error, the fear that drove the wrong decisions, the genuine desire to help that led, catastrophically, to harm. And if we miss that, we cannot learn from it. Because the lesson is not, those people were stupid and we are smart. The lesson is, those people were trying just like we are trying. And they were wrong in ways they could not see, just like we are. And the only way to do better is to stay curious, to keep questioning, to resist the comfort of certainty, to keep the window open even when it feels frightening, even when the night air feels cold and unfamiliar, even when everything you have been taught says to close it. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room is not what is coming in from outside. It is the stale air that has been trapped inside for too long, the ideas that have been sealed off from fresh thinking, the beliefs that have been kept warm and still and protected until they have used up all the oxygen and there is nothing left to breathe. And when you open the window, when you let the air in, it is not always comfortable. It is not always warm, but it is real, and real, even when it is cold and complicated and uncertain, is better than the comfortable illusion of a sealed room. That is what this story, at its deepest level, is about. Not fresh air, not sunshine, not medicine, but the courage to open the window. Even when you have been told your whole life that doing so is the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. Let your breath slow down now, just for a moment. Feel the air in the room where you are. Notice it. It is there. It has always been there. Invisible, necessary, moving in and out of you without any effort on your part. You breathe without thinking about it. You always have. Every human being who ever lived breathed the same air, in different forms, in different places, under different skies. The Roman physician who wrote about corrupt vapors, he breathed air every morning, every night. The mother in London in 1790 who closed the window over her fever child, she breathed air. She kept breathing, even as she worried, even as she prayed, even as she watched and waited. The tuberculosis patient lying on a mountain sanatorium porch in Switzerland in 1895, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching clouds move across an alpine sky. She breathed air, cool and thin and moving, and felt, perhaps for the first time in months, that her lungs were satisfied. We are all just breathing, all of us, always, and yet we have spent centuries arguing about what that breath carries, what it means, what it does to us, what we should fear in it. And underneath all of that argument, underneath all of the theories and the sealed rooms and the pomanders and the Nobel Prizes, the air was always just air. Neutral, patient, indifferent to our theories about it. Just moving, just being breathed. There is something quietly remarkable about the simplicity of what it took to shift this belief. Not a complex machine, not an expensive drug, not a long and dangerous surgical procedure. Just an open window, just light through glass. Just the ordinary world doing what it has always done, being allowed to enter a room that had been sealed against it. And people getting better. Not always. Not guaranteed, but often enough to notice. Often enough to say, wait, something is different here. Something is working. The sanatorium patients who improved did not improve because of elaborate medicine. They improved because someone gave them a chair on a porch and pointed it toward the mountains and said, sit here, breathe, rest. And their bodies, which had been waiting for exactly that, responded. Because the body knows things the mind has not caught up to yet. It knows it needs air that moves. It knows it needs light on skin. It knows it needs to be connected to the outside world rather than sealed off from it. It has always known, even when the doctors were saying otherwise. Even when the curtains were drawn and the windows were latched and the fires were burning in summer to keep the room warm against the dangerous outside. The body was still quietly asking for what it needed, still turning, almost imperceptibly, toward whatever light came through the cracks in the curtains, still slowing its breath whenever, against doctor's orders, someone left a window open just a little and the night air came in, cool and quiet and real. Now, think about the sailors, those men who lived on the water, who slept under stars, who woke to wind and spray and the smell of open ocean. They did not have theories about fresh air. They did not debate whether it was safe to breathe. They just breathed it, and their lungs were clear. And the prisoners who lived near ventilated windows, who felt the air move through their cells, who could not choose their circumstances but happened to be placed near a crack in the wall where the outside world came in. They lived longer, not because they understood why, just because the air was there, and the children in the streets, the ones whose parents could not afford to keep them safely indoors, the ones who played in alleyways and markets and fields and breathed whatever came. Their bones grew strong, not in spite of the exposure, because of it, all of them, sailors and prisoners and street children, living proof of something that the sealed rooms and the medical journals and the university lectures were actively working to deny. That the world outside is not the enemy. That air is not a carrier of poison. That light is not a threat. That the body, given what it actually needs, often knows what to do. There's a kind of peace in that. A quiet, settled peace. The kind that comes not from certainty, but from letting go of the need for certainty. From accepting that the world is complicated. That we have been wrong before, that we will be wrong again, and that somehow, despite all of that, despite all the sealed rooms and the wrong theories and the beliefs that stayed too long and the truths that arrived too late, somehow we are still here, still breathing, still turning toward the light. The doctors who got it wrong were not so different from us. They woke up in the morning wondering if they were doing the right thing. They lay awake at night thinking about patients who did not recover, wondering what they had missed. They wanted to help. They tried to help. And some days, despite everything, they did. And some days, despite everything, they did not. And they kept going anyway. Because that is what you do. You keep going. You keep asking questions. You keep looking out the window, even when you're not sure what you're looking for. The air is soft tonight. Wherever you are, whatever weather is outside your window, the air is there, moving, patient. It has been moving since long before anyone thought to theorize about it. And it will keep moving long after the last theory has been replaced by a better one. There is something comforting in that permanence, in the fact that the physical world does not wait for us to understand it correctly before it keeps doing what it does. The sun rose every morning over all those sealed sick rooms. It came through the cracks in the curtains, found the edges of the shutters, crept along the floor, even when no one let it in, even when the doctors said it was dangerous. It came anyway, quietly insisting on itself, the way truth tends to do, slowly, patiently, without drama, until one day, someone opened the curtain just a little, and the room filled with light, and someone lying in that room, feverish and exhausted and barely holding on, felt it on their face, and breathed, and felt, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that the world was not entirely against them, that something out there was on their side, something simple and ancient and free. Just the sun, just the air, just the ordinary world, being let in at last. We began tonight with a window, with the idea that something as simple as a window, open or closed, could be the difference between life and death, between healing and harm, between wisdom and terrible, well-intentioned mistake. And now, at the end of this long walk through history, we find ourselves back at that window. But we see it differently. We see it not just as a piece of glass in a frame, not just as an architectural feature, not just as a boundary between inside and outside. We see it as a question. What are we letting in? What are we keeping out? And are we sure, truly sure, that we have those two things in the right order? Because the people who sealed those windows were sure. They were absolutely, institutionally, professionally sure. They had books. They had authority. They had centuries of tradition. And they were keeping out the very thing that could have helped. That thought is worth carrying gently. Not with panic. Not with the anxious feeling that everything you believe might be wrong. But with a kind of soft, humble openness. A willingness to sit with uncertainty the way you might sit with a window open on a cool night. Letting the air move through. Not trying to control it. Not trying to analyze it. Just letting it be there. Just breathing. There's a woman I keep thinking about. She does not have a name in the historical record. She is not famous. No one wrote a book about her. But she is there, implied in all of this history. Present in the pattern. She is the woman who, sometime in the middle of the 19th century, was caring for a sick child. A child with fever, with a cough that would not stop. And the doctor had come and gone, had sealed the windows, had prescribed rest in a warm, closed room, and she had followed the instructions. For days, watching her child get worse, feeling the air in the room grow thick and still. And one night, when the child's fever was very high and the room felt like it was suffocating both of them, she made a decision. She opened the window, just a little, just enough to let a small breath of night air into the room. And she stood there, waiting, terrified that she had just done something dangerous, something the doctor had specifically told her not to do. But the air came in, cool and soft, and the child, burning with fever, turned toward it, the way a plant turns toward light, instinctively, without thought, just toward the thing it needed. And maybe the child recovered. Maybe they did not. We do not know. But that woman, in that moment, was doing something that took courage. She was questioning the authority that had told her the window was dangerous. She was trusting something older and more instinctive than any book or any university. She was trusting what she could feel. That cool air on a hot face is not poison. That something the night brings might be what the body is asking for. That the world outside is not always the enemy. And in that small, quiet act of rebellion, she was ahead of the entire medical establishment. Not because she was smarter, not because she had better information, but because she was paying attention to the child, to the room, to the air, to what was actually happening rather than what the theory said should be happening. And that is perhaps the most enduring human skill, the ability to pay attention, to notice when the evidence in front of you does not match the story you have been told, to sit with that discomfort, to resist the urge to explain it away, to let it ask its question, and to answer honestly, even when the honest answer is inconvenient. Even when it means opening the window against all advice. Even when you're not sure what is going to come in. You know, the history of medicine is full of these moments. Moments where the truth was not in the laboratory, not in the journal, not in the mouth of the expert, but in the quiet observation of someone paying attention. Semmelweis watching death rates in maternity wards and noticing that doctors' hands were the variable. Jon Snow walking through Soho with a notebook, talking to residents, following the pattern to its source. Florence Nightingale counting deaths in military hospitals and finding the math inexorable. The sealed wards were killing people. The evidence was there. You just had to look. These were not moments of dramatic genius. They were moments of stubborn, patient attention, of refusing to look away from what the numbers were saying, what the patterns were showing, what the bodies themselves were demanding. And that kind of attention is available to all of us, not just scientists, not just doctors, not just people with letters after their names. Any person who is willing to sit quietly and notice what is actually happening, rather than what they have been told to expect. Any person who is willing to hold their certainties lightly and their questions seriously, that person is participating in the same tradition. The tradition that slowly and painfully and imperfectly moves us forward. Now the air outside is doing what it always does, moving, carrying whatever it carries, pollen and dust and the smell of wherever you are. Rain, maybe, or the dry warmth of somewhere southern, or the particular cold of a northern night. It is not poison. It is not medicine, exactly. It is just the world. And the world does not care whether we have a right theory about it. It just keeps moving. The sun will come up tomorrow over the same places it rose over when Galen was writing his treatises in Rome, over the same mountains where tuberculosis patients sat on sanatorium porches, breathing cool air and feeling something like hope. Over every sealed window that was finally, after all that time, finally opened, the light will be the same light. The air will be the same air, and we will breathe it, and we will look out our windows, and we will wonder, as humans have always wondered, whether we are seeing the world clearly, whether the story we have been telling is true, whether the windows we are keeping closed in our lives, in our minds, in our institutions, are keeping us safe, or keeping us from something we need. That question does not have a simple answer. It never does. But the asking of it is its own kind of breathing, its own kind of letting air in. And tonight, that is enough. You have walked a long way through history, through sealed rooms and mountain sanatoriums and prison wards and naval decks and the streets of cholera-stricken London and the laboratories of Pasteur and Koch and the quiet revolutionary act of a woman opening a window in the middle of the night. You have walked through 2,000 years of being wrong about something simple and finding the way, slowly, back to truth. That is a long walk, and you can rest now. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Not too slow, not too fast, just the rhythm your body chooses when you stop trying to control it. The air in the room is enough. It has always been enough. Let your eyes be heavy. Let the thoughts that want to come. And let them drift the way air drifts without needing to be held or organized or understood. Somewhere tonight, a window is open, and the air is moving through it, quiet and patient and indifferent to every theory that was ever wrong about it, just being what it is, which is all any of us can do. Sleep well. The window is open.